The metallic click of the radio transmitter echoed through the cramped basement on Wilhelmstrasse as Mayor Klaus Brenner's fingers hesitated over the transmission key. Outside, the distant rumble of Allied bombers grew louder over Berlin, but inside this hidden communication center beneath the Reich Security Main Office, an even more dangerous storm was brewing. It was March 23, 1944, and Brenner held in his trembling hands the most sensitive intelligence document in the German war machine, the complete operational plans for Unternehmen Bernhard, a massive counterfeiting operation designed to flood the Allied economies with billions of forged British pounds and American dollars. But instead of transmitting the final coordination signals to activate the operation as ordered, Brenner was about to commit an act of treason that would make him the most hunted man in the Third Reich. The Morse code message he was preparing to send would not reach German sleeper cells across Europe. It would go directly to Allied intelligence in London, carrying with it the complete destruction of Germany's most ambitious economic warfare campaign. The weight of his decision pressed against his chest like a steel plate, as he realized that in the next 60 seconds he would cross a line from which there could be no return, transforming himself from a decorated Wehrmacht intelligence officer into the most valuable double agent the Allies never knew they had recruited. Klaus Brenner had not been born to betray his homeland. The son of a modest clockmaker in the Bavarian town of Rosenheim, he grew up in a household where precision, patience, and unwavering dedication to craft were the highest virtues. His father, Hermann Brenner, had served in the Great War with quiet distinction, returning home with a limp and a deep skepticism about grand political promises, but also with an unshakable belief in duty to one's comrades. Young Klaus absorbed these lessons while learning to repair the delicate mechanisms of cuckoo clocks and pocket watches, developing the methodical mind that would later make him invaluable to German military intelligence. When he excelled in mathematics and languages at the gymnasium, his teachers recommended him for officer training, seeing in him the kind of analytical precision the modern military required. Klaus enlisted in 1936 not out of fervent Nazi ideology, but from a traditional sense of service that had been passed down through generations of Brenners who answered their country's call. His superiors quickly recognized his gift for codes and communications, and by 1939 he had earned a commission in the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, where his fluent English and French made him ideal for coordinating operations across occupied Europe. Those early years seemed to validate his father's teachings about duty and honor. Klaus threw himself into his work with the same meticulous attention to detail he had learned at his father's workbench, never questioning the broader implications of the intelligence he processed and transmitted. His colleagues respected his competence and reliability, though some noted that he seemed to lack the ideological fervor that drove many of his peers, an observation that would prove more prophetic than anyone realized. What none of them understood was that Klaus possessed something far more dangerous than political passion. He had inherited his father's moral compass, and it was about to point him toward a destination that would shock everyone who thought they knew him. The war that began in September 1939 initially seemed to confirm everything Klaus had been taught about German military superiority and strategic brilliance. From his posting at Abwehr headquarters in Berlin, he coordinated communications for the lightning campaigns in Poland and France, watching with professional admiration as German forces achieved victories that military theorists had declared impossible. The rapid success of these early operations reinforced his belief that he was serving a cause that, whatever its political complexities, was fundamentally about defending German interests against hostile encirclement. But as his security clearance increased and his access to sensitive intelligence expanded, Klaus began to see aspects of the war that troubled the moral foundations his father had instilled in him. The reports filtering through Abwehr channels spoke of actions in occupied territories that went far beyond military necessity, describing policies toward civilian populations that violated every principle of honorable warfare Klaus had been taught to respect. Initially, he rationalized these troubling accounts as exaggerations or isolated incidents, telling himself that war inevitably produced regrettable excesses that were not representative of German military values. However, as his position within the intelligence hierarchy grew more senior, the evidence became impossible to dismiss or explain away, forcing him to confront the reality that the regime he served was implementing policies that his conscience could not accept. The decisive moment came in late 1943 when Klaus gained access to classified documents detailing the full scope of Unternehmen Bernhard, a counterfeiting operation that represented the largest economic warfare campaign in history, but which also revealed the extent to which his own expertise was being used to fund and facilitate activities that contradicted everything he believed about honorable military service. As he studied the operational plans, Klaus realized that his technical skills were not just supporting legitimate military objectives, they were enabling a systematic campaign of economic destruction that would harm millions of innocent civilians in Allied nations while providing resources for programs whose true nature filled him with revulsion. The global conflict that engulfed Europe by 1940 had evolved far beyond the conventional military campaigns that military academies taught, and that Klaus had initially admired for their strategic sophistication. By early 1944, the war had become a total conflict involving not just armies and navies, but entire national economies, civilian populations, and the fundamental question of which political and social systems would survive into the post-war world. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht was locked in a brutal stalemate with Soviet forces that had cost millions of lives and stretched German resources to their breaking point, while in the West, Allied forces were clearly preparing for a massive invasion of occupied Europe that would open a second front and potentially divide German attention fatally between East and West. The strategic situation that German High Command faced was increasingly desperate as American industrial production continued to outpace German capacity by ratios that made long-term victory mathematically impossible unless dramatic new weapons or tactics could shift the balance decisively. This reality had prompted the development of what German planners called special measures, unconventional warfare programs designed to achieve strategic effects that traditional military operations could no longer accomplish given Germany's declining relative strength. Unternehmen Bernhard represented one of the most ambitious of these programs, conceived as a way to attack Allied economic stability directly by flooding their financial systems with billions of perfectly counterfeited British pounds and American dollars, thereby undermining confidence in Allied currency and potentially triggering economic chaos that would hamper war production and civilian morale. The operation required unprecedented coordination between intelligence services, printing facilities, distribution networks, and sleeper agents across multiple countries, making it one of the most complex covert operations ever attempted and placing enormous responsibility on communications officers like Klaus, who managed the secure channels through which orders and intelligence flowed. What made the operation particularly dangerous was not just its scale, but its timing. Allied intelligence agencies were increasingly effective at penetrating German networks, meaning that any security breach could expose not just Bernhard, but dozens of other sensitive programs that depended on the same communication channels and personnel for their operational security. The pressure that began building around Klaus in early 1944 came from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a perfect storm of operational demands, security concerns, and moral conflicts that would have tested even the most ideologically committed officer. His immediate superior, Oberst Friedrich von Manstein, had received explicit orders from Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler's office to accelerate the Bernhard timeline, pushing the activation date forward by 3 months to coincide with what intelligence suggested would be the Allied invasion of France, thereby maximizing the economic disruption during a critical period when Allied financial stability was essential for maintaining the massive logistical effort required to sustain a continental invasion. This acceleration meant that Klaus was working 18-hour days, coordinating with printing facilities in Sachsenhausen, transmission schedules with agents in London and New York, and security protocols with counterintelligence officers who were becoming increasingly paranoid about Allied penetration of German networks. The stress was compounded by Klaus's growing awareness that the forged currency was not just intended for general economic disruption, but specifically to fund what internal documents euphemistically referred to as special administrative programs in occupied territories. Programs that Klaus's security clearance now allowed him to understand were systematic campaigns of persecution and elimination targeting civilian populations deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. Each time he transmitted coordination signals for Bernhard operations, Klaus knew he was facilitating not just economic warfare against legitimate military targets, but the funding of activities that violated every principle of military honor his father had taught him to respect, creating an intolerable tension between his duty as a German officer and his conscience as a human being. The breaking point came when Klaus received a classified addendum to the Bernhard operational plans, revealing that a significant portion of the counterfeited currency was specifically earmarked to purchase supplies and equipment for concentration camps, making him a direct participant in financing activities that he could no longer rationalize as legitimate military operations, no matter how broadly he interpreted the concept of total war. In that moment, sitting alone in his communications center beneath Berlin as Allied bombers droned overhead, Klaus faced a choice that would define not just his own fate, but potentially the outcome of one of the war's most significant covert operations. He could continue following orders and remain a loyal German officer, or he could find a way to sabotage Bernhard and become something his training had never prepared him to be. The transformation from loyal Wehrmacht officer to active saboteur did not happen overnight, but evolved through a series of carefully calculated decisions that reflected Klaus's methodical nature and his deep understanding of intelligence operations. His first step was to identify potential contact methods with Allied intelligence without exposing himself to immediate discovery by German counterintelligence, a challenge complicated by the fact that his own position gave him access to many of the security protocols designed to prevent exactly the kind of contact he was contemplating. Klaus realized that his greatest advantage was also his greatest vulnerability. His role as a communications officer meant he had legitimate reasons to monitor Allied radio frequencies and transmission patterns, but any deviation from normal monitoring procedures could trigger security reviews that would expose his intentions before he could accomplish anything meaningful. After weeks of careful observation, he identified a specific window of opportunity during routine maintenance of the Berlin transmitter array, when he could send brief messages on frequencies that Allied intelligence monitored without immediate detection by his own side, provided he disguised the transmissions as routine signal testing that was standard procedure during equipment maintenance. His first contact with Allied intelligence came on February 14, 1944, when he transmitted a simple numeric sequence that he knew Allied cryptographers would recognize as a German military code format, but which actually contained a basic message identifying himself as a Wehrmacht intelligence officer with access to significant operational intelligence who was requesting secure communication protocols for potential collaboration. The response came 3 days later during another maintenance window, a coded acknowledgement that provided Klaus with a specific frequency schedule and encryption method that would allow him to communicate regularly with what he assumed were British intelligence services, though he later learned his contacts were actually a joint British-American operation that had been hoping for exactly the kind of high-level German intelligence source that Klaus represented. Over the following month, Klaus established his credibility by providing verified intelligence about German defensive preparations along the Atlantic Wall and details about V-weapon development programs that Allied intelligence was able to confirm through other sources, gradually building the trust necessary for him to reveal his most sensitive information about Unternehmen Bernhard, without his Allied contacts dismissing it as disinformation designed to waste their time and resources. The intelligence that Klaus began transmitting to his Allied contacts in March 1944 represented some of the most valuable information that reached Allied hands during the entire war, providing not just details about specific German operations, but insights into the broader strategic thinking that guided Nazi leadership during this critical period. His initial reports about Bernhard included complete organizational charts showing which German agencies were involved in the counterfeiting operation, detailed timelines for the activation of sleeper cells in major Allied cities, and perhaps most importantly, copies of the actual printing plates and currency designs that would allow Allied authorities to identify and intercept counterfeit notes before they could circulate widely enough to cause economic damage. But Klaus's access to German intelligence went far beyond the Bernhard operation, enabling him to provide his Allied contacts with information about defensive preparations for the anticipated invasion of France, including the location of hidden artillery positions, the deployment schedules for mobile reserves, and the communication frequencies used by commanders who would coordinate the German response to Allied landings. Each transmission required elaborate security precautions to avoid detection by German counterintelligence, forcing Klaus to develop increasingly sophisticated methods for disguising his communications as routine technical activities, while actually providing some of the war's most sensitive intelligence to Germany's enemies. The psychological strain of maintaining his cover while systematically betraying everything he had been trained to protect was enormous, made worse by his growing awareness that his information was being used to plan operations that would inevitably result in the deaths of German soldiers who trusted him as a loyal officer and colleague. Yet Klaus found the moral clarity he needed by focusing on the larger implications of his actions. Every piece of intelligence he provided to the Allies potentially shortened the war and reduced the total suffering on all sides, while specifically undermining operations like Bernhard that represented the worst aspects of Nazi ideology rather than legitimate military objectives. His most significant intelligence coup came in late March when he gained access to documents revealing that Bernhard was just one component of a broader program called Action Feuerland that included plans for systematic destruction of economic infrastructure in areas that German forces might be forced to abandon, a scorched earth policy that would have caused massive civilian casualties and economic devastation across occupied Europe if implemented as planned. The morning of March 23, 1944, brought a crisis that forced Klaus to accelerate his timeline and take risks he had hoped to avoid for several more weeks. Oberst von Manstein burst into the communications center with urgent orders directly from Berlin. Bernhard was to be activated immediately across all European networks due to intelligence suggesting that Allied invasion forces were already loading onto ships in British ports, meaning the economic disruption had to begin before Allied financial systems could be stabilized for the massive expenditures that a continental invasion would require. Klaus found himself facing the most dangerous moment of his covert career as von Manstein stood directly behind him, watching over his shoulder while dictating the specific transmission codes that would activate sleeper cells in London, New York, Stockholm, and Geneva simultaneously, triggering the release of billions of dollars in counterfeit currency that would flood into Allied banking systems within 48 hours. The irony was almost unbearable. Klaus's superior was essentially forcing him to choose between maintaining his cover and allowing one of the war's most damaging economic attacks to proceed, or exposing himself as a traitor in order to prevent catastrophic damage to Allied financial stability during the most critical period of the European War. As von Manstein dictated the activation codes, Klaus realized that his only chance to sabotage the operation without immediate exposure was to transmit the codes correctly to German networks while simultaneously alerting his Allied contacts about the activation, hoping they could move quickly enough to intercept the counterfeit currency before it circulated widely. But this plan required split-second timing and absolute precision. Any hesitation or error in his transmissions would alert von Manstein that something was wrong, while any delay in warning the Allies would allow enough counterfeit currency to enter circulation to cause significant economic damage. The weight of the decision pressed against Klaus like a physical force as he positioned his hands over the transmission key, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the success or failure of operations that could affect the outcome of the entire war. His father's voice seemed to echo in the cramped underground room, reminding him that honor sometimes required courage that others might call betrayal, and that true loyalty meant serving principles larger than any single nation or ideology when those conflicted with fundamental human decency. Klaus's fingers moved across the transmission key with the practiced precision of a clockmaker, sending the activation codes exactly as von Manstein had dictated, while simultaneously implementing a sabotage plan so subtle that its discovery would require the kind of detailed technical analysis that would take days to complete. The codes he transmitted to German sleeper cells contained a nearly invisible modification, a single character change in the frequency verification sequence that would cause the receivers to interpret the activation signal as a test transmission rather than an operational command, effectively neutralizing the Bernhard network without immediately alerting German intelligence that the operation had been compromised. As von Manstein watched approvingly, Klaus completed what appeared to be a flawless transmission of the Bernhard activation codes, but was actually the most sophisticated act of sabotage in the history of electronic warfare, disabling billions of dollars in counterfeit currency operations with a technical manipulation so elegant that it would have impressed his clockmaker father with its precision and subtlety. The moment von Manstein left the communications center, Klaus shifted to his predetermined emergency frequency and transmitted a compressed burst containing everything Allied intelligence needed to understand and counter the Bernhard operation: activation timelines, cell locations, currency distribution methods, and most critically, the actual printing plate specifications that would allow immediate identification of counterfeit notes. His Allied contacts responded within hours with confirmation that they had intercepted the counterfeit currency shipments in London and New York, arrested 17 German agents, and secured the printing facilities before any significant amount of fake money could enter circulation, representing one of the most complete intelligence victories of the entire war. But Klaus's triumph was shadowed by the knowledge that his sabotage could not remain secret indefinitely. German intelligence would eventually discover that the Bernhard activation had failed due to technical sabotage rather than Allied luck, and when that happened, suspicion would inevitably focus on the small number of officers who had access to the transmission codes and technical knowledge necessary to implement such sophisticated electronic deception. The investigation that followed would test every skill Klaus had developed as an intelligence officer, but now applied to protecting himself rather than German operations, requiring him to misdirect suspicion while preparing for the possibility that his double life might be discovered at any moment. The immediate aftermath of the Bernhard failure created exactly the kind of security crisis that Klaus had anticipated, but its intensity exceeded even his pessimistic expectations, as German counterintelligence launched the most comprehensive investigation in Abwehr history. Within 48 hours of the operation's collapse, every officer who had handled Bernhard communications was subjected to detailed interrogation by specialists from the Gestapo and the SS Security Service, men whose reputation for extracting confessions was legendary throughout the German intelligence community and whose methods Klaus knew could break even the most highly trained operatives if applied systematically over time. The challenge Klaus faced was that his sabotage had been too successful, the complete failure of Bernhard across all networks simultaneously was so unprecedented that German investigators immediately focused on the possibility of internal betrayal rather than Allied intelligence penetration, meaning that Klaus's own competence had made him a prime suspect in the investigation designed to uncover his treachery. His interrogation began on March 26th, conducted by Sturmbannführer Heinrich Krause, an SS counterintelligence specialist whose previous successes included exposing Soviet agents within German military intelligence and who approached the Bernhard investigation with the methodical intensity of a hunter tracking wounded prey through a forest where any misstep could prove fatal. Krause's questions were designed to identify inconsistencies between Klaus's account of his activities and the technical evidence recovered from the transmission logs, forcing Klaus to maintain a perfect balance between appearing cooperative and avoiding admissions that could link him to the sabotage, all while managing the psychological pressure of knowing that any slip in his performance could result in immediate arrest and execution. The interrogation sessions stretched over 6 days, with Krause returning repeatedly to the technical details of Klaus's transmissions, searching for the kind of minute discrepancies that had exposed other double agents and that represented Klaus's greatest vulnerability, since his sabotage had required modifications to standard transmission protocols that left traces detectable by sufficiently sophisticated analysis. Klaus survived these sessions by employing the same meticulous preparation that had characterized his intelligence work, rehearsing his responses until they became automatic, while maintaining the emotional control necessary to project the combination of professional competence and personal loyalty that Krause expected from a Wehrmacht officer whose record showed no previous indication of disloyalty or ideological deviation. The weeks following Klaus's interrogation brought a deceptive sense of normalcy, as German intelligence concluded that the Bernhard failure resulted from Allied penetration of the communication networks rather than internal sabotage, a conclusion that reflected both Klaus's successful deception and the broader assumption among German security services that their own personnel remained fundamentally loyal despite the deteriorating military situation. But Klaus understood that his reprieve was temporary. The investigation had revealed security vulnerabilities that would inevitably lead to changes in communication protocols and personnel assignments that could eliminate his access to sensitive intelligence while increasing surveillance of all officers who had been involved in compromised operations. His Allied contacts confirmed his fears by reporting increased German security measures and requesting that he minimize communications unless he had access to intelligence of exceptional strategic value, essentially acknowledging that his usefulness as a source might be ending just as the war entered its most critical phase. The irony of his situation was that Klaus's success in sabotaging Bernhard had actually reduced his ability to provide further intelligence, creating a professional dilemma that paralleled his personal struggle between duty to his oath and loyalty to his conscience. During April 1944, as Allied invasion preparations intensified and German defensive efforts reached fever pitch, Klaus found himself relegated to routine communication duties that provided minimal access to the kind of high-level intelligence that had made him valuable to Allied operations. While German security services implemented new protocols specifically designed to prevent the kind of internal sabotage that had destroyed Bernhard. His last significant intelligence transmission came on May 2nd, 1944, when he provided Allied forces with detailed information about German defensive preparations around Normandy, intelligence that would prove crucial to the success of Operation Overlord, but which also represented Klaus's final act as an active double agent, since the transmission protocols that made it possible were discontinued immediately afterward as part of the security reforms triggered by the Bernhard investigation. The message Klaus sent that night contained not just tactical intelligence about German positions, but also a personal acknowledgement that his career as a source was ending. Allied intelligence would need to find other ways to penetrate German operations, while Klaus would need to find other ways to contribute to what he had come to see as a moral imperative to end a war whose continuation served no legitimate purpose. The transformation of Klaus from active saboteur to passive observer during the final months of the war proved almost as challenging as his earlier double life. As he watched events unfold with the terrible knowledge that he could no longer influence their direction despite his unique understanding of German strategic thinking and operational capabilities. The successful Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 vindicated his decision to betray Bernhard and provide defensive intelligence, but also filled him with conflicting emotions as he witnessed German soldiers, many of them decent men like himself, who had been trapped by circumstance and ideology, dying in battles that his information had helped make possible. His position within German intelligence gave him access to reports from the front that painted an increasingly desperate picture of Wehrmacht capabilities, revealing that the military situation was deteriorating even faster than Allied planners had anticipated, and that German resistance would likely collapse within months rather than years if current trends continued. But Klaus also had access to intelligence about Nazi plans for the final phase of the war, including preparations for what party leaders called the Alpine Fortress, and programs designed to continue resistance through guerrilla warfare even after conventional military forces surrendered. Plans that convinced him that his sabotage of Bernhard had been only the beginning of what might be required to prevent unnecessary prolongation of a conflict whose outcome was no longer in doubt. The moral complexity of his situation deepened as Klaus realized that his knowledge of these final Nazi preparations gave him potential opportunities to shorten the war's conclusion. But acting on such opportunities would require him to risk exposure and execution when the war's end was clearly approaching, regardless of his intervention. His decision to remain inactive during this period reflected not cowardice, but a calculated assessment that his survival might serve larger purposes in the post-war period, particularly if he could provide Allied authorities with intelligence about Nazi plans for continued resistance that might threaten European stability long after formal surrender. The waiting became almost unbearable as Klaus watched colleagues preparing for what they believed would be a heroic last stand, while he knew that their sacrifice would accomplish nothing beyond prolonging suffering on all sides, a knowledge that isolated him emotionally from men who had been his friends and comrades for years, but who could never learn the true reasons for his growing detachment from their shared cause. The collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945 found Klaus in the unique position of being simultaneously a decorated Wehrmacht officer and one of the most valuable intelligence assets in Allied hands, a duality that created immediate challenges for American and British authorities who needed to balance recognition of his contributions against the necessity of maintaining security about sources and methods that might be needed in the emerging conflict with the Soviet Union. His surrender to American forces on May 8, 1945, the same day Germany officially capitulated, was carefully orchestrated through pre-arranged signals that identified him to Allied intelligence officers as a protected asset, rather than a standard prisoner of war, though the cover story used to explain his special treatment required him to undergo the same initial processing as other German officers to avoid suspicions from fellow prisoners who might compromise his post-war security. The debriefings that followed his surrender provided Allied intelligence with unprecedented insights into German operations and strategic thinking, but also revealed the full extent of Klaus's emotional and psychological struggle during his years as a double agent, experiences that had left him with what modern observers would recognize as severe symptoms of post-traumatic stress resulting from the constant pressure of maintaining his cover while systematically betraying colleagues who trusted him. His American interrogators, led by Major William Ashford of the Office of Strategic Services, quickly recognized that Klaus represented more than just a valuable intelligence source. His story embodied the kind of moral complexity that would define post-war efforts to understand how ordinary individuals had navigated the ethical challenges posed by totalitarian regimes, making him a potential symbol of resistance and redemption that could serve broader political purposes in the emerging Cold War environment. But Klaus himself wanted nothing more than to disappear from the historical record, requesting only that he be allowed to emigrate quietly to the United States, where he could rebuild his life without the burden of explaining his wartime activities to either American authorities or German compatriots who might view his actions as either heroic or treasonous, depending on their own political perspectives. The intelligence debriefings continued for 6 months, during which Klaus provided detailed information about Nazi plans for post-war resistance, Soviet intelligence operations he had observed, and the organizational structure of German intelligence services that might serve as models for American operations in the developing confrontation with the Soviet Union. Klaus's post-war life in America began in early 1946 when he arrived in Kansas under a new identity provided by the OSS, settling in the small town of Heston, where his background in precision mechanics allowed him to find work repairing farm equipment and industrial machinery, occupations that provided both economic security and the kind of anonymity he desperately wanted after years of living under intense scrutiny and constant danger. The transition from Wehrmacht intelligence officer to American farm mechanic represented more than just a change of profession. It was Klaus's attempt to reclaim the simple moral clarity he had known in his father's clock shop, where problems had clear solutions and success was measured by the reliable operation of precisely calibrated mechanisms rather than by body counts or strategic objectives. His neighbors in Heston knew him only as Klaus Brennan, a German immigrant who had arrived after the war and whose mechanical skills and quiet reliability made him a valued member of the community, though some noticed that he never spoke about his wartime experiences and seemed to carry himself with the disciplined bearing of a former military officer. The psychological scars of his double life healed slowly through the routine of honest work and the gradual development of genuine relationships with people who valued him for his character and competence rather than his access to secret information or his potential usefulness to intelligence operations. In 1949, Klaus married Anna Schmidt, a German-American school teacher whose family had emigrated to Kansas in the 1920s and who understood the challenges of building a new life while maintaining connections to a homeland that had been transformed by war and defeat. Their marriage provided Klaus with the stable foundation he needed to process his wartime experiences, without the isolation that had characterized his first years in America, though he never shared the full truth of his activities with Anna, telling her only that he had served as a communications officer who had become disillusioned with Nazi ideology and chosen to cooperate with Allied forces rather than continue fighting a war he believed was morally wrong. The birth of their children, Hermann in 1951 and Margaret in 1953, completed Klaus's transformation from conflicted intelligence officer to devoted family man, giving him a future-oriented purpose that helped him move beyond the guilt and uncertainty that had dominated his emotional life since his decision to sabotage Bernhard in 1944. The recognition that came to Klaus decades after the war ended was both unexpected and unwelcome, beginning with a letter from the CIA in 1973, informing him that his wartime activities had been declassified as part of congressional investigations into intelligence operations and that historians were beginning to document his contributions to Allied victory in World War II. The letter was signed by former OSS officer William Ashford, now a senior CIA executive, who explained that Klaus's sabotage of Unternehmen Bernhard was being recognized as one of the most significant intelligence coups of the war, potentially saving Allied economies billions of dollars in damage while providing crucial intelligence that contributed to the success of the Normandy invasion and the broader Allied strategy in Europe. Ashford's letter included copies of declassified documents showing that Klaus's intelligence had been distributed to the highest levels of Allied command, influencing strategic decisions made by General Dwight Eisenhower and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and that his actions had been cited in post-war analyses as examples of how individual moral courage could affect the outcome of global conflicts. But for Klaus, now 60 years old and fully integrated into his American life, this recognition felt more like an intrusion than an honor. He had spent nearly 30 years trying to forget the moral compromises and emotional trauma of his wartime service, and the prospect of public attention threatened the quiet anonymity that had allowed him to heal and rebuild his sense of personal integrity. The historians and journalists who began contacting Klaus found him reluctant to discuss his experiences, not out of false modesty or security concerns, but because he genuinely believed that his actions had been morally necessary but not heroic, representing the minimum standard of human decency rather than exceptional courage worthy of celebration. His consistent refusal to grant interviews or participate in historical projects reflected his conviction that the real heroes of the war had been the soldiers and civilians who had died fighting against tyranny, not intelligence officers like himself who had survived by maintaining elaborate deceptions that, however necessary, had required him to betray personal relationships and violate oaths of loyalty that he had taken seriously despite their ultimate allegiance to an evil cause. The letters that arrived at Klaus's Kansas home throughout the 1970s and 80s provided dramatic testimony to the long-term impact of his wartime sabotage. As Allied veterans and their families learned details about operations that had remained classified for decades and began to understand how intelligence, provided by sources like Klaus, had influenced the battles they had fought and survived. A Royal Navy officer wrote to thank Klaus for intelligence that had helped protect Atlantic convoys from German submarine attacks, while an American infantry veteran credited information about German defensive positions with saving his unit from what would have been a catastrophic assault during the Battle of the Bulge. Perhaps the most moving correspondence came from a British intelligence officer who had been part of the team that received Klaus's transmissions about Bernhard, explaining how the advance warning had allowed Allied authorities to intercept counterfeit currency operations that could have destabilized the financial system supporting the war effort during the most critical period of the European campaign. These letters provided Klaus with a perspective on his wartime activities that he had never possessed while living through the events themselves, the knowledge that his moral decision to betray German operations had contributed to specific, measurable benefits for Allied forces and civilian populations, helping him finally resolve some of the guilt and uncertainty that had troubled him for decades. But even this recognition could not eliminate Klaus's fundamental ambivalence about his wartime role, as he remained convinced that circumstances had forced him to choose between competing loyalties rather than allowing him to demonstrate the kind of unambiguous heroism that he associated with soldiers who had fought openly and honestly for causes they believed in. His standard response to requests for interviews became a polite but firm statement that he had simply done what his conscience required under extraordinary circumstances, and that the real heroes of the war were the men and women who had died fighting against evil, rather than those who had survived by finding ways to serve competing masters simultaneously. The broader historical significance of Claus's actions became clear only as researchers gained access to German archives and began to understand the full scope of Nazi economic warfare programs that his sabotage had disrupted, revealing that Unternehmen Bernhard was part of a comprehensive strategy to attack Allied financial stability that could have significantly prolonged the war if successfully implemented. Economic historians calculated that the counterfeit currency operation would have introduced approximately $12 billion in fake money into Allied financial systems, creating inflation and undermining confidence in Allied currency at precisely the moment when massive war expenditures required stable financial markets to maintain public support for continued military operations. The psychological impact of widespread currency counterfeiting would have been particularly devastating in the United States, where public confidence in the dollar was essential to maintaining the domestic unity necessary for sustaining a global war effort that required unprecedented levels of government spending and civilian sacrifice. Claus's sabotage had prevented this economic attack during the critical months leading up to the Normandy invasion, when any disruption of Allied financial systems could have forced delays in the invasion timeline that might have given German forces additional months to strengthen their defensive preparations along the Atlantic Wall. Military historians later identified Claus's intelligence about German defensive positions as contributing factors in the success of specific Allied operations, including the breakthrough at Saint-Vith and the successful defense of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, battles whose outcomes affected the timing of Germany's final collapse and the post-war division of Europe between Allied and Soviet spheres of influence. The strategic implications of Claus's actions extended beyond their immediate military impact to influence the post-war order in ways that even he had not anticipated, as the intelligence he provided helped ensure that Allied forces advanced faster than Soviet forces in certain critical areas, affecting the boundaries that would define the Cold War confrontation for the next 45 years. The final chapter of Claus's story unfolded quietly in the farmlands of Kansas, where he lived out his remaining years as a respected member of a community that never fully understood the global significance of the modest German immigrant who repaired their machinery with the precision of a master craftsman and the patience of a man who had learned to value simple honesty above all other virtues. He died peacefully in 1991 at the age of 78, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew him as a loving father and grandfather, whose wartime experiences had taught him to treasure the ordinary pleasures of family life and community belonging. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned only that he had served in the German army during World War II before emigrating to America, where he had built a successful business and raised a family, making no reference to intelligence operations or acts of sabotage that had influenced the course of history. The funeral was attended by nearly the entire population of Heston, reflecting the affection and respect Claus had earned through 3 decades of quiet service to his adopted community, though none of the mourners realized they were bidding farewell to one of the war's most significant intelligence agents. In the months following Claus's death, his family discovered among his personal effects a collection of letters from Allied veterans expressing gratitude for his wartime service, along with copies of declassified documents that revealed for the first time the full extent of his contributions to Allied victory, materials that provided his children with a new understanding of their father's character and the moral courage that had defined his response to one of history's greatest challenges. But perhaps the most telling testament to Claus's character was found in a letter he had written to his son Hermann, but never sent. explaining that he hoped his family would remember him not for what he had done during the war, but for the kind of man he had chosen to become afterward, when the extraordinary circumstances that had tested his conscience gave way to the ordinary opportunities for decency and service that define most human lives. The letter concluded with a reflection that captured the essential truth of Klaus's story, that heroism often consists not of single dramatic acts, but of the daily choice to live according to principles that honor the best aspects of human nature, even when such choices require personal sacrifice and moral complexity that others may never fully understand. The legacy that Klaus Brenner left behind extends far beyond the specific military intelligence he provided or the operations he sabotaged during World War II, representing instead a compelling example of how individual moral courage can influence historical events even when such courage requires difficult choices between competing loyalties and conflicting definitions of honor and duty. His story challenges simplistic narratives about wartime heroism by demonstrating that the most significant acts of resistance to evil often come not from those who never face moral compromise, but from those who find ways to serve justice despite being embedded within systems that require them to violate their deepest convictions about right and wrong. The technical sophistication of Klaus's sabotage, disabling a multi-billion-dollar economic warfare operation with a single character modification in a transmission code, illustrates how modern warfare creates opportunities for individual actions to have strategic consequences, making personal moral choices matters of global significance in ways that previous generations could never have imagined. But perhaps more importantly, Klaus's post-war life demonstrates that redemption is possible even for those whose service to justice requires them to betray oaths and relationships they had previously honored, provided they use their freedom to build lives dedicated to the simple virtues of honesty, service, and love that give meaning to human existence regardless of the historical circumstances that surround them. His refusal to accept public recognition for his wartime activities reflects a mature understanding that true heroism consists not in dramatic acts of defiance, but in the patient work of building a world where such acts become unnecessary, because justice and human dignity are protected through legal and democratic institutions rather than individual conscience alone. The questions that Klaus's story raises about the nature of loyalty, duty, and moral responsibility remain relevant in an era when technological power continues to create opportunities for individual actions to have global consequences, while political and ideological conflicts continue to test the ability of ordinary people to maintain their integrity under pressure. As we reflect on Klaus Brenner's extraordinary journey from loyal Wehrmacht officer to Allied saboteur to quiet American citizen, we are reminded that the greatest victories in humanity's struggle against evil are often achieved not through grand military campaigns or political movements, but through the accumulated choices of individuals who refuse to surrender their moral agency even when circumstances seem to offer no alternatives except compliance or resistance, honor or treachery, loyalty or betrayal. His story proves that courage sometimes requires us to break rules that others consider sacred in order to serve principles that transcend national boundaries and political ideologies, and that such courage often demands not just the willingness to risk personal destruction, but the wisdom to recognize when established authorities have become instruments of injustice rather than protection for human dignity. The precision with which Klaus executed his sabotage, using his technical expertise to defeat a $12 billion operation with a single keystroke, demonstrates that in the modern world, individual conscience can wield power that rivals armies and nations, making personal integrity a matter of global consequence in ways that previous generations could never have anticipated. But the most profound lesson of Klaus's story may be his understanding that heroism is incomplete if it serves only to defeat immediate evil without contributing to the construction of a better world where such dramatic choices become unnecessary because justice is protected through institutions rather than individual sacrifice. His decision to disappear into American anonymity after the war, rejecting opportunities for fame and recognition in favor of the quiet work of building a family and serving a community, reflects a mature vision of heroism that values the ordinary virtues of love, service, and integrity above the extraordinary acts of defiance that circumstances may occasionally require. Would you have found the courage to break your oath and betray your comrades in order to serve a higher loyalty to human decency and justice? Would you have chosen the path of quiet redemption over public recognition, understanding that true heroism often consists not in dramatic gestures, but in the patient work of building a life worthy of the sacrifices others made possible? Comment below and share this story so that others might remember that in a world where individual actions can have global consequences, personal moral courage remains the foundation of every victory worth achieving and every peace worth preserving.